Morning, guys. I guess we should go ahead and get started because she wants us to start right at 10. Um, I guess it says to start with a brief introduction. I can start if that's fine with you guys. Cool. My name's Maddie. I'm a junior political science major. And then for the icebreaker question, I would say that my favorite unit from this second half of the class is Unit 8, and that's because I really ended up being super interested in the 2000 election. Um, I think I like stuff when it's like super like drama heavy. Like there's like it's kind of like gossipy, it's kind of funny. I think it makes it easier to like learn. So I like did the whole unit and then I would be like catch myself explaining it to my friends and I was like they certainly don't care but this is super interesting to me. So I would say unit 8 was definitely my favorite of this half of the class for sure.
Okay, I'll go next. Hi guys, my name's Ariana. I'm also a political science major and a junior. And honestly, I was about to say the same thing. Like Unit 8, like the elections fiasco was by far my favorite. I think it was really like fascinating to study both like the 2000 and the 2020 elections because it honestly made me like realize how seemingly small like administrative issues are. And like especially like the confusing ballot layouts or like post-election denialism. I thought that was like crazy how it can spiral into like a full-blown national crisis. So just learning about that really was like the most interesting to me. Yeah.
I can go next. My name's Abdullah. I'm a bioinformatics major, and I'm a senior. The one that I found the most interesting was probably Prep Work Portfolio Unit 7, which I believe was the Tea Party one, if I'm not mistaken. Or was that? No, that was 9, sorry. Right? I think. Regardless, it was the one about Tea Party. I found that one to be really interesting because a lot of times you hear about how like smaller like parties don't really get to have as much of a say. And obviously while the Tea Party was, within the Republican Party, found it super interesting that they were able to kind of take control and like influence a lot of the politics that were going on during that time period that they had a lot of power in. So I thought that's cool.
I can go now, I guess. Um, I'm Jack. I'm a poli sci major. I'm a junior. Um, I'm gonna say that my favorite unit was also the Tea Party one. For similar reasons. I liked learning about how it was kind of like a precursor to kind of what we see more modernly now. Just kind of by a different name, kind of how it originated that way. Um, I kind of like tracking the history of that, and then it kind of like followed through into kind of what you could see how they control it more in different ways now, like in Unit 10. I think it was kind of transferable and I liked it.
My name is Isla Riggs. I am a sophomore. I'm double majoring in poli sci and criminal justice. I enjoyed Unit 10 the most. I think it was really interesting to learn about how Trump was able to like manipulate all these people, especially Lindsey Graham. Yeah, I definitely enjoyed it the most. And while listening, I was just like, wow. Or reading, I read the transcript. I was just like, wow, just really a hypocrite. So yeah.
My name is Justin. I'm a senior, majoring in business administration. I'd say I liked Unit 8. I just liked the first episode where it talked about all the different leaders, like Castro, like Clinton, Bush. I just like learning about people like that.
Do you guys have any particular unit you guys want to start with? I mean, I'm hearing a lot of 8s. Is that the one we want to just go straight to 8? Cool. I can read off the first question. What did you know, if anything, about the fallout to the 2020 election prior to listening to reading the ballot battle chapters and the January 6th report summary?
I can go first. Honestly, not as much as I thought. Um, I guess like I followed like leading up to the insurrection on January 6th and all of that, but then like the afterwards. with like his impeachment and stuff. I don't know why I wasn't following that back then, but all of like the what was it called? Um, sorry, one sec. Yeah, I guess I just didn't like know as much about like what they were investigating and what reasons to support what he had done, if that makes sense. So then I actually got to learn all of that through reading it, which was cool.
I'll go next. Yeah, I'm honestly like again in the same boat as you. I think before this unit, the only thing I really knew was how like Trump challenged the election results and then also like falsely claimed widespread voter fraud. But I actually just didn't realize just how coordinated and like deliberate the efforts were. It was only until like reading, I think it was the ballot battles and the January 6th report, which opened my eyes to things like the fake elector strategy across multiple states. But like it actually helped me realize that it was just like a highly organized attempt to overturn the election outcome. But yeah.
Yeah, I agree with Ariana. I knew that Trump was calling fraud and just going on rants, especially on social media. That's really how I kept up with it. Like I'm just seeing what he's doing on social media, um what's being talked about, but I didn't know what was really going on behind the scenes. Like I'm thinking he's just ranting, but in reality he's actually like doing a lot behind the scenes to like Ariana said, it was really coordinated. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have too much to add there. I think I'm also in the boat of like when I was paying attention to what was going on at the time, I kind of just also I think this chapter kind of opened my eyes up to like how organized it was because I mean, I'm gonna also compare this to Kanye, but like we see that like he's kind of like been going through it the past few years and kind of going crazy. And I thought like both of their cases were kind of similar where they were just bugging. But then to kind of read about and find out that like, hey, there was actually a lot of thought that went into this, and how this all occurred was really interesting to read.
Yeah, I think I would say that I'm probably in the same boat as everybody else. Like I knew kind of like I knew what was happening through like the eyes of social media. But like going through like the things that we talk about and the things that we learned about in Unit 8, it's kind of like you kind of see more about the implicit strategies, like what they did, kind of what Silas said behind the scenes, as opposed to like just kind of what you see through social media, or like through the eyes of like what Donald Trump was saying himself.
All right, I if no one else wants to add anything, I think we can move on to the next question.
Yeah, you guys pretty much covered it. Yeah.
There. So then overall, oh, sorry, wrong one. In your opinion, what were the most interesting, surprising, maddening, etc. moments in the January 6th report summary?
I think for me, it was how far he took it. I think there's a difference between being like, we need to recount the votes versus what he was saying, which was find the votes, like find the votes for me, make them up if you have to. I think going within the systems, like we saw in the 2000 elections, like people got really mad at Gore. Sorry to like jump ahead, but people got really mad at Gore for like picking specific cities to recount in, even though that was what made the most sense to his campaign. Whereas Trump is like, wherever you can find the votes, like give them to me, I want them. And so I think that was the scariest or like most surprised, not surprising, but like definitely really crazy.
Going off of what you said, Madeline, I'd say that like honestly one of the most maddening parts was not only that, but how like his own advisors, like Trump's own advisors, including like Bill Barr and his campaign lawyers, were repeatedly telling him that there was like no evidence of any widespread fraud, yet Trump continued to push that narrative like publicly. It showed like a complete disregard for truth and like a willingness to endanger like the stability, like the democratic stability. So I was just like taken aback by that. But yeah.
Well, yeah, he's also pressuring the Secretary of State, I believe, in Georgia to disregard ballots or discard ballots and stuff like that, which is like pretty bananas. Shouldn't be able to do that.
Yeah, kind of just to build off of like what you guys are saying, like there was from like top to bottom like pressure on a lot of people um for like through Trump to have it his way. I mean, the report mentioned how this report was really just written out and gotten like one perspective and kind of like everybody's like thoughts and like the objective like facts about what happened, like all of that was just kind of compiled. And even with all of that, like such a comprehensive report was just like blatantly disregarded and like not even like thought of as like as fact. And it's like very interesting to see how despite being such an official document, like there was just no care in the world for it.
Okay, something that was really surprising to me was the fact that Trump's own vice president, Mike Pence, he was pressured, of course, by Trump to, do the wrong thing and try to call the election in their favor, but he didn't do that. So I like that he stood his ground. A lot of politicians around Trump weren't doing that. So the fact that he was able to sit back and realize that, his president was doing a little too much and, he knows that he can't bend the rules. Um, that was surprising to me.
That's why he's not vice president now.
Yeah, very true.
It's so funny that you bring that up because, like, literally, if it was any other Republican, like, imagine you put Lindsey Graham in that position, like, he would have folded to Trump, and imagine how that would have gone. So, not that I like Mike Pence, but thank God he did that because, I mean, just like, it's so crazy.
Agreed.
I think that was like, I don't know, that was what was kind of the most maddening part to me was like the reaction of the Republican Party to Mike Pence saying that he wasn't going to just like let it happen. It was overwhelmingly negative. Like even like the politicians themselves were like negative towards Mike Pence after that, but the constituents and the voter base were like death threats. And it was insane. It was like that, it was terrifying, but it was that I think that was the most maddening part to me.
Um, Overall, how did reading through the January 6th report summary make you feel about contemporary US politics?
I think for me, it honestly made me feel more alarmed about like how durable, like the durability of American democracy. Like the fact that so many political figures went along with obvious lies out of like fear or ambition shows that our institutions are only as strong as like the people we entrust to uphold them. So like I just feel like the idea of corruption is just so much more like prevalent and like under alarming underneath all of these issues. But yeah, it just made me a lot more alarmed.
Something I thought a lot while reading this that kind of goes off what you were talking about is like, if I don't forget it right now, is the idea that like, nope, I lost it. Come back to me. Sorry, give me a sec.
Okay, well, I agree with Ariana. I feel like we have come a long way, since the United States was established, but especially since Trump, we're definitely going backwards, and we're going backwards pretty fast. So yeah, I feel like, like as of lately, it's just like she said, it's alarming and it's worrying. And it makes me feel like things are, well, first of all, he's only been president for a couple of months now. So I feel like over the next 3 years, well, 3.5 years, I feel like it's just gonna get worse.
I remembered what I was gonna say. Um, I feel like in combination with like the fact that he's pushing and testing like all of the limits of our like power and like structure of our government, like you were saying before, on top of like challenging actual laws and stuff, he's going against a lot of precedent and a lot of norms that have been established, which can be really worrying because you're watching him do stuff and you're like, the president is supposed to go to that thing or the president's supposed to do that, but it's not a law, so he's not going to do it. And so not only do you have him trying to like break and override and overreach all of these like actual laws and authorities, he's also breaking all these norms. So like you're just watching him do everything in the most confusing way, which again seems very intentional because you have news coverage of the really horrible stuff he's doing, and then you have the news coverage of he wore a blue suit to the Pope's funeral, and both of those get news attention, and both of those are just press for him.
Um, Sorry, I was still kind of thinking about the question, but I think one thing that the report mentioned, let me see if I have it pulled up. But it talked about somewhere in the middle about the amount of pressure that Mike Pence faced with the fact that, you know, he wasn't just going to blindly support everything. And like there were phone calls to him, there were death threats on his life, all that kind of fun stuff. But I think it kind of goes to show, like, especially recently, and especially throughout the different chapters that we've or portfolios that we've done now, the lack of pressure to kind of do the right thing, or like the right thing, because there's so many people who will just completely fold and like they just want to push what they seek, regardless of whether or not the way that they do it is considered like correct. Okay. Does anyone want to add anything before we move on? Okay. Um, Next question, question two. What did you know, if anything, about the 2000 election prior to listening to the Fiasco podcast?
Literally, all I knew was that it was a super, super, super close election, and it had something to do with Florida, and that one of the candidates had like a governor brother of Florida, and that's literally all I knew.
Honestly, same. The only thing I knew about the election was that it was incredibly close and how like Florida obviously played a key role. But I also had no idea how many different factors like played into that, like from the flawed like voter rolls to like confusing ballots, which helped combine to create the crisis. But I will say listening to Fiasco helped me see that the problems weren't just about the recounts. It like honestly started like well before election day too. So there's that.
I just knew the candidates. That was kind of all I knew.
Yeah, I didn't really know anything. It was a long time ago.
Yeah, I didn't really know much either.
Yeah, I just same. I just knew it was a really close election and who the candidates were. But podcast is very, very interesting.
So then on that note, in some way, the story of the 2000 presidential election sounds like a scripted movie with Florida in the starring role. In what ways did Florida embody the perfect storm, thereby putting it front and center?
I think the first major piece that they were talking about in episode 2 was like the exit pollings and all of like the VNS model that would allow you to like track who would be likely to win in each state for the electoral college. And what happened in the 2000s was that they were calling it and it was all getting narrowed down, and then it all came down to Florida, and that's kind of where I think you first see Florida as setting the center stage, because it literally all came down to Florida in that one night, and then you see it unfold over the following weeks with all of the different cities and stuff. But I would say, yeah, right then and there is kind of when they become like front and center.
I'd say Florida was like a perfect storm simply because it had everything you wouldn't want in a closed election. Like it had a governor, like Jeb Bush, who was like the brother of one candidate, and then like the partisan Secretary of State, I think her name was like Catherine Harris. It also had like widespread issues of outdated voting machines and like obviously the poor ballot design. But even on top of that, like the media exacerbated the confusion by calling Florida like incorrectly on election night. So it was just like all of that at once, which made it just like crazy. But yeah.
Yeah, it started with I this was really cool. In the podcast they said it started with like one guy at Fox News calling Florida, and the other news stations were like, well, they can't be the first to get it. So then they all called Florida, and like kind of like a monkey see, monkey do situation where it's like, oh, we gotta beat them to the punch. And it's kind of wild that they just all lied or like didn't have information and they just followed the word of one person.
I would say also, like Elian Gonzalez and then the Homestead Air Force Base also made Florida a really hot topic. Like, when have you ever heard of like a major presidential election coming down to like such tiny issues in one state? And that's not to say that the election was entirely decided based on those issues, but obviously the author of the podcast presented pretty strong evidence that those were strong contenders for why people would vote in a certain direction in Florida. So I think that also made Florida kind of a interesting state to study for this.
I personally don't have anything to add. Um, yeah. Do we want to move on?
Yeah, I don't have anything to add, so we could move on as well.
Okay. The next question. In your opinion, what were the most maddening moments of the podcast? That is, at what point in the podcast, if any, did you become most exasperated, disappointed, etc., when learning about the 2000 election fiasco?
I can answer first. The first episode was definitely disappointing when they were talking about um the little boy, Elion Gonzalez. Yeah, the treatment of him because he was 6. So the way he was treated was just disappointing because it's like this little boy became the center of a whole political scandal or whatever. And but the most disappointing part about that was when the host was talking about how the house he was in was stormed and they grabbed him by gunpoint. And I just feel like that was just so unprofessional of the feds at the time, because just like once again it's a little boy, he's not a threat. The people he was with were also weren't a threat. They were just trying to protect him. But yeah, the circumstances around all of that was just sad, and the fact that this was like used by the candidates as well, to like increase their following. I just feel like, it's kind of sad. It was tough.
No, like I totally agree with you. For me, I think the most frustrating part was like learning about how the voter purges like disproportionately targeted Black voters specifically. And like the fact that voters who realized that they made mistakes on confusing ballots, they actually had no way to fix them. So it's like they intentionally left that like error in there. It felt like the system was being stacked against like a fair election just from the beginning. It just honestly felt like predetermined.
That's exactly how I felt when I was reading about like the hanging chads and the pregnant chads and like intent to vote. It was to me, and maybe I'm crazy, if it's punctured through a little bit, I feel like that's intention to vote. I understand the reasons why they did it, but it was just so frustrating having to like listen to that and being like, those people clearly were intending to vote, and everyone's like calculating the votes differently and deciding intent differently. And it was just like a whole mess. And I don't know how they thought it was ever going to end up like well, if that makes sense.
It definitely felt like very sloppy and like inconsistent, where it was like everyone was just kind of feeding their own input and being like, oh, like you said about like the punches, like the intent is there, the intent is not there. It's like, bro, like if someone went to go vote, they went to go vote. And so it's definitely an interesting case where it's like, how do you even like how why would you set yourself up to have that kind of problem in the first place? Like you should definitely clean up the way that you have the whole process so that you don't have to worry about something like that in the first place. So I think, yeah, it was like sloppily organized in that sense. Okay, I'm gonna take the silence as we're ready to move on. Um, so this is, I think it's for question 3, we get to pick one of 3 cells if I'm not mistaken. Does everyone just want to go around, take a minute and decide what they want to tackle? We can either, I mean, know that we have to do this as a group and tackle one, or if we want to tackle separate ones.
We do media influence.
I'm okay with that, yeah. Do you want to start first? And does anyone want to do something else?
Anyone want to do anything else? Okay. Well, yeah, I just wanted to going back to the Gore Bush election. Well, after not all of Florida's votes were counted, I think yeah. There's like a data error that gave Bush 22,000 extra votes in Florida. But since all the other all the media companies had already kind of said um he won, they didn't go back. They just let it happen and be like, okay, Bush won. And that was kind of crazy to see like the effect that media had on elections. And it really like kind of brings us to nowadays where um you say one thing in the news and then you kind of get pinned in this box, or like little clips get posted online and then millions of people are affected and it affects their way of voting. And it's kind of just insane how much media has sway and can sway an election in our society. I don't really like it. I think everyone should just have like their own research, do their own policies, or look at the policies and do their own research on each policy and what they want, and kind of make a decision for themselves instead of having someone who's getting paid millions of dollars from either side tell them how to vote.
Well, I definitely, just going off of what Justin said, I definitely believe that the media could do a better job at like obviously their research before they take on any issues for that matter. For me personally, I think Catherine Harris was the one that claimed that media caused the fiasco. And while media does like make the mistakes of like the incorrect early calls in Florida, added like then they also added confusion. I still believe like at the root, the systematic election issues were the real problem, like with the ballot design flaws and the partisan state officials, and honestly also the lack of like a standardized recount rule. I feel like that may have played at least like somewhat of a bigger role in this scenario than just the media alone. I do think that it's like a double-edged sword though. Like I think because of all of this, like the media definitely could have done a better job at like looking into those specific issues. But I think they're honestly both to blame. I just wouldn't mainly pin it on the media per se
Yeah,
because of,
I was just I
oh
wasn't
no, yeah, I agree with
completely
you. I agree with
blaming the
you. Yeah.
media.
I
I
was just saying, I
agree.
think it's like more, yeah, you're good.
Yeah, I agree with what you said too. Like, I'm not solely blaming the media, but I'm saying it also has a big part in it. It kind of go hand in hand in each other, like you said.
Yeah, yeah.
I would say at that point you made at the end where like I feel like they kind of needed each other, like the media and then like the representatives to try and like spread whatever was happening at the time. I think what you were saying, Ariana, about like how it's not entirely the media, but the media definitely like starting with calling Florida early, like that caused big problems, but so did all of the election issues. And honestly, I would go as far to say that like you couldn't have had this without having both, if that makes sense. Like you needed all the election issues, but then you also needed the media coverage of all of the election issues. Um, I don't want to jump to the next question, but having social media in the 2000 election would have been insane. So that's really crazy. But yeah, I totally agree with you. I think it's very much both that were needed, and to claim that it wasn't like an individual or systemic issue at all is just a lie.
I also don't think that media was the only problem. But I see why it played such a big role because in episode two, Real Numbers, they the host talked about exit polling, so they were already as soon as people were leaving the polls, they were, counting votes and calling projected winners. Like George Bush, at first it was predicted he was gonna lose. And then it was predicted that he was gonna win. So it's just like the back and forth, it was confusing. The networks were trying to be like first to call the winner and stuff like that. It was like competition, stuff like that definitely played a big part. Because they just wanted to be like on top of things better than other networks, specifically like CBS, NBC, they covered those specific networks in the episode. So yeah, so while there definitely was other factors in play, I can see why the media, kind of made it worse.
To your point, like these media companies, they want to be first to call something, they want to be first to the punch, and they want to be the best. So sometimes they go maybe not the best way of doing it, maybe create stuff, or they hear one thing and they don't do their research, and then they're like, all right, and then they tell us maybe the wrong information. And I think they should do due diligence before they actually bring stuff to the public.
Yeah, I was just gonna add that like I do agree with y'all, but I think like there was a point to where like I mean all the flaws in the system were already there. And at that point, like there was nothing that could really be done about them at that moment because I mean that compromised a lot of the election integrity. And so at that point, like to me, it was just kind of like, well, you already like messed up there. So I think like obviously the media didn't cause all the issues in the election, but they definitely amplified a lot of the problems because it was like not doing your due diligence, reporting early, and just kind of like sending about like misinformation, there does not like help the case at all. It only makes it worse. So yeah, like the media didn't cause it, but like it definitely amplified everything.
If everyone's good, we could segue to the next part of the question. Cool. So I already kind of wanted to touch on it, but I definitely think that if social media had existed in the 2000s, especially this point about like 40% of households like having internet, um, I think naturally it would make things a lot worse. You see like misinformation spread every single day today. And during a time where there actually was so much confusion about what was happening, like you see the Trump election, it was very clear that Biden had won, but still he was spreading that he had won the election and his followers were spreading that he had won the election. Imagine if it was an election where it was actually that close together and you have both people fighting with each other saying, my candidate won, no, my candidate won. It's just exacerbating all of those issues we saw in the 2000 election, but even further. So I think it definitely would have been really, really horrible to have it back then.
I'd go, honestly, I agree with you. Not only like if social media had existed back then, not only misinformation, but I think conspiracy theories that have also like exploded online. Like we saw in 2020 how fast like the Stop the Steal spread. So like in the 2000s, I can only imagine like seeing the Brooks Brothers riot live on Twitter would have like likely fueled an even greater distrust and maybe even more protests. I just think it would cause like a lot of aggression because obviously like we've seen how misinformation can like, especially with Trump, like it literally like fueled all of this like rage amongst its voters. So I can only imagine like the amount of riots that it could potentially start had it existed in the 2000s.
Yeah, I was gonna say pretty much the same thing that both of you said. Like, given the fact that like you can see all of the violence and like riots and inciting that happened just from like the 2020 election, and it wasn't that close, um, you could definitely extrapolate that like it would be much, much worse if it was much more widespread and there weren't like mainstream news sources telling you the information. It was like some guy from Twitter telling you to go blow up the Capitol building. But it would have been like 30,000 people from Florida telling you to go blow up the Capitol building. I don't know. It is interesting to think about, but I do think it would have been much more of a violent outburst.
Yeah, I agree with what everybody said. It would have been worse.
Well, especially if social media was back like around back then, it would be so new. No one would know we've had social media our whole lives, so we kind of can tell what's real, what's not, and we can kind of like figure it out ourselves. But if it was back then, that would have meant it was the start of it. So many people wouldn't be able to differentiate, this is real, this is false, and not know how to work social media. So again, it would incite more confusion and a lot more radicalism.
I think going off that point about like I think we're educated in social media. I think like our generation obviously is, and the generation like before us, but like there still are like very much like a lot of generations that like did not grow up with social media. And so I think like introducing it that early, um, would have made things significantly worse. Because I would say that like misinformation, like amongst like the older generations, when it comes to like seeing something on social media and being like, oh, that's true, like still heavily exists. And I think I've also seen like my peers that like it's usually like a harmless thing that like isn't super important, but like they'll see like a fact like that is like not real, and they'll be like, oh, did you know this? And it's like that wasn't real. And so like I think that like the misinformation would obviously be worse. I don't think that I think like we still struggle with it today with so many people just believing anything they see anyway. And like back then like internet, like I remember, I mean obviously I wasn't around for 2000, but I mean like even in the early 2000s, like people would rely so heavily on like what the internet was saying, because they were like, oh, like it's this magical box that's telling us what like the world knows, so obviously it must be true. But it's like no, anybody can add to it, so just random people are giving their inputs on it.
Yeah, to like, for example, like my mom sent me a deep fake of like Trump 2 weeks ago saying he's gonna like punch Zelensky in the face, and my mom was like, "I can't believe he would say this. Like, it's gonna ruin everything." And I was like, "Hey, that's not real. Like, can you so stuff like that, like, and especially back then, like she like I wasn't alive, we weren't alive, or maybe we were, I don't know, maybe 1 years old, but like that was the vote, that was who's voting. So if they saw stuff like that, it would have just caused so much commotion.
We are at 10:37. If we're doing like 30 minutes per unit, we are running like a little bit behind. So if we're all good to move on to unit 9. Um, there is your group is required to choose to answer the questions in at least one of the cells below. There is strategy and structure, rhetoric and priorities, and then coverage and response. Um, I personally I personally like the first two, strategy and structure, and like rhetoric and response. Does anyone have any strong feelings towards any of the columns?
The second column, I like.
Do you want to start off then?
Sure. Okay. So I'll read the question too. Although references to an organized Tea Party were fading by 2016, how did the Tea Party success foreshadow Trump's rise to prominence in the Republican Party? Do you think there would have been a President Trump if not for the Tea Party? I like this question because I actually definitely did take a note on it. I'm gonna find it real quick. Oh, it's right here. Okay. So chapter 5, I had wrote the Tea Party can be compared to Trump supporters who view others as a threat to America. And this just reminded me of also their like mission reminded me of Trump's slogan, Make America Great Again. Because that's basically what the Tea Partiers wanted. Like they just wanted us to go back in time and they wanted everyone to be conservative. They felt like they were more conservative than, Republicans now. That's why they would challenge them all the time. So yeah, it really just reminded me of Trump supporters because, they're like die hard about their beliefs and they do what they feel like they need to do to like stay in power or well come in power and then stay in power. So I do think that if the Tea Party didn't exist, would there still be a President Trump? I mean, mm, I'm not sure. I don't know, but I do think that they are very close related though. Like Trump supporters remind me of Tea Partiers for sure. And I got that from did I say chapter 5, by the way? But yeah.
Yeah, that's totally true. I think like the biggest thing that I took out from, I think they started talking about it in chapter 1, was that the Tea Party is like they're just a bunch of reactionary conservatives. They're just mad about what's happening and they want to go back to how it was. And that's literally what Trump and all of his followers are to me. Then I would go as far to argue that if there was once a Tea Party, well, there still is. That's like reactionarily conservative. And then you have Trump and his followers as reactionary conservatives. I just think that there's a demographic of people who will always be like that, and it's just a matter of whether or not they're able to find each other. And I would say that the Tea Party's success definitely aided in that, but that's not to say that Trump would not have existed without the influence of the Tea Party, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was
Tea
gonna
Party-
kind of.
After you, Jack, you got it.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
All right. I was gonna say that I kind of agree. Because in my head, the Tea Party is kind of just like it is sort of just the precursor for what the MAGA movement would eventually become. And it set the scene kind of like establishing and bringing people into like a more radical mindset. Like the whole like their strategy for like increasing their voter base was trying to get like it was fear-based politics. It was like us or them. It was like we need to bring back or well they didn't say bring back, they say take back because they want you to actively try and like take something back that was taken from you. And I think Trump does an excellent job of like portraying that same like vitriol. So I think it like probably still could have happened. It maybe just wouldn't have happened as fast as it did because it does feel like it just was like 2016 and now it's like uh-oh. Um, so like I feel like if the Tea Party didn't exist, it would have the result would have been the same, it just would have been farther down the road.
Yeah, well, I like kind of the Tea Party just thought that all the other Republicans kind of like sold out and weren't like pushing their ideals. So, and then they looked at Trump as this guy who was there to save them. So they kind of had this big action and push for him. Because I like in 2016, he wasn't really taken that serious at first, like in the primaries. And then he would like I think he like roasted like Jeb Bush or something, and then people were like, "Oh my God, this guy's hilarious." And then they actually looked at his policies, and then they kind of were like, "Oh yeah, he agrees with what I want to say." And then they made a big push for him. And like Jack said, it wouldn't have happened as fast without them, but I think it still would have eventually happened.
No, I agree. I think like honestly, just like the Tea Party's distrust of the elites and its prioritization of like ideological purity is what made Trump's takeover like mainly possible. As far as like a left wing, like could a left wing Tea Party succeed? I think a left wing version could definitely succeed by focusing on like a decentralized relational organizing. But it would have to be very strategic to avoid any like coalitions or like fracturing coalitions, I'd say. Yeah.
I'd also say it'd be really difficult just considering how like center the Democratic Party is today compared to like other countries. I think the way that I think of left leaning is like the very few and far between like uh, even further than that, but like, you know, like the AOCs and the Bernie Sanders of them all, like if there was more of that, even then they're still struggling to get stuff passed within their own party. Um, I think that if they were able to organize better, like you were saying, they would be able to have more successes, but the Democratic Party and people organizing on the left has always been a struggle for them. So I think that they should. I think that we know how they should, and whether or not they'd be successful is really like a little bit up to them and their willingness to actually try and achieve an end goal.
Um, Kind of talking about the comparisons between Trump and the Tea Party, I think their strategies were like pretty similar. I would say like Trump would have existed without the Tea Party, in my opinion. I think like the guy has been always very set in his ways. And so I think they kind of both had this like similar approach when kind of getting power with like the Tea Party. I think it mentions in chapter 3 about how they were kind of trying to just steal up a lot of the Republican seats and like force people out. Trump also very much did the exact same thing where whenever there were individuals who were, you know, really heavily pushing against it. I think, I mean, we'll talk about this more in chapter 10, but there was a lot of talk about how like he would basically flip people over onto his side. And I think while the Tea Party didn't flip people over, they were definitely able to find like those smaller voices and kind of unite them into one. And that is definitely what Trump did by planting a seed in a lot of people's heads of like, this is who I am. I'm not gonna lie to you. Like, and he made himself out to be like the man of like the working man. And I think like both of their approaches kind of went hand in hand together.
Yeah, to build off that, I think he's always been kind of a charismatic person. So I think like without like the Tea Party, he still would have gotten a lot of people on his side, just the way he operates.
I want to answer the second question. I think maybe like a couple of years ago, it would be hard for a left-wing group to do what the Tea Party did. But I feel like now, I feel like if Democrats really like, especially the Democrats that are already speaking out against Trump, if they really worked to kind of create their own faction within the party and they work to, actually get Trump out of there. I feel like one, I feel like they should. And two, I feel like they could, especially now, because I feel like people are really just like fed up with Trump. Even some of, his supporters are changing their opinions. So I feel like now between 2025 and the rest of Trump's presidency, if it happened, I feel like they will be successful. Maybe moderately at first, but I feel like they could make a change.
Well, I think what's coming. I've been seeing a lot of Gavin Newsom recently, and he's kind of like he has this podcast where he's having like Republican talking heads like on his podcast, and he's kind of trying to become more moderate, like in the middle. And I think he's doing that in order for the upcoming election, where he'd be like, "Hey, like I can get both votes from both sides, so he can get elected as a Democrat." And I think that's a pretty smart play, honestly, because you're not ostracizing one side of the docket. You're trying to garner votes from both sides.
Yeah, going off of what Justin said, I honestly think like if they were to just focus on winning local elections first to like push the party from the inside out, I think that would have a better result than just like what they're normally doing. I just think they have to like work their way up, honestly.
Yeah, like you said, Ariana, like I don't think that like the Tea Party, like what I guess their model, I don't think it was like necessarily like inherently bad. Like I mean all they really tried to do was because they were very much at like the local representation and then before pushing higher. And so I think like the Democratic Party could very easily do that. And I mean, like, if they were able to unify themselves within that branch, because I mean, that is like the whole reason why you have like corporations, PACs, all these kind of things. Like, they exist to push the things that they want to see. And so it's like, well, if you can get a group of like-minded individuals to start finding places throughout the US and like, getting their votes there, like, I don't really see an issue with that, regardless of what side you're on. That to me is just like more strategic. That's just strategic to me. Does anyone want to talk about Dr. Blum, or do we want to talk more on strategy and structure? Because truth be told, I didn't care too much for Dr. Blum. So then I'll ask the questions. Imagine you're talking to a friend. They tell you that they want to mount a real challenge to the established Republican and or Democratic parties by running a candidate for their choosing. They aren't interested in being talked out of their decision, but they do want your advice. What overarching advice would you give them based on Dr. Blum's research on the rise of the Tea Party in the early 2000s?
Um,
Um, oh, sorry, go ahead, go ahead.
um, I'll say that I would tell my friend to like gain a following, gather people that have the same exact ideas as my friend. 'Cause that's really what the Tea Partiers were doing. Like they had those conventions to find a whole bunch of candidates and then, have the candidates run and hopefully one of them wins, so you just have to get that support make sure everybody's on the same exact page as you, and you might be able to make a difference. That's all.
For me, if a friend told me they wanted to like challenge an established party, I would strongly advise them just based on Blum's research to work inside a major party rather than to start a third party from scratch. Blum kind of explains this in like the how the Tea Party captured the GOP. I think it was like chapter 2, that the Tea Party succeeded by creating what she calls like a miniature party within the Republican Party. So like because they did that, they were able to develop their own like leadership structures while like also maintaining like messaging platforms and candidate pipelines without having to deal with like the massive barriers that third parties can face within like American politics. So I would just honestly recommend them to like work inside rather than just like going off and making a whole new third party. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that the Tea Party really did well. And Blum talks about it, like the different types of like factions within parties and how they operate and like how they work. But it seems as though like you can see that like the insurgency, like the insurgent faction that Blum described as like the Tea Party worked really well in like capturing the like Republican base. Um, so like I guess it seems kind of evil to suggest it, but like having that sort of party where you can like secure the voter base by using politics that like captivates their head, and then using that to secure votes for your candidates, and then eventually working your way up and like taking over the party, and creating your own sort of like mainstream political voice. I mean, I think that's like it worked effectively and it's working effectively modernly. So like I think that's like a probably the most efficient way to do it. Unfortunately, just because you're like targeting people's insecurities, and with that you get like a more loyal voter base, and then people want support from that voter base.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think working within the party would definitely be something that Dr. Bloom, I think, would recommend, but then also like finding your audience, if that makes sense. Like the Tea Party and Trump, like they found their reactionary conservatives, and so they've met a need and found their audience. And I think that while further left Democrats, I mean, their audience is out there for certain. I think they've just struggled to kind of meet with them and connect on that point. And I think working within a party where so many are already voting, like you're either voting for a Democrat or you're voting for a Republican. That's just kind of how our system works. So if you have people working within that party, you can slowly begin building up support for those people and eventually end up like potentially changing the structure of the party, like you see with the Tea Party. So I think that definitely staying within the party, but also like finding your audience would be the two most important things.
I definitely think, yeah, just taking that time to kind of flesh out that base. Jack mentioned like insurgent factions, and I think like when I think of like the base that the Tea Party had, it was a very aggressive, very like nationalistic, like they thought like multiculturalism was like a problem. And so I think like in order for like a left-wing insurgent party to work, like I think if they want to be an insurgent faction, I think that would be, I mean, obviously not fine. I'm not saying you should ever be, like violent about it, but I think like finding a different way to be like aggressive. Because I think that's what made it so successful was because they were able to like rile people up, like and get them so hot. It was like that is how like an insurgent faction like functions. And so like if someone wants to repeat the same, they just have to look at their party base and like recognize like what does like your party base getting aggressive look like for you, and going from there, because like every party is different, and every like the base of the people are different. And so if you go in the same way that you would like a right wing, like you're not going to succeed because they're motivated by different things and they're also going to get angry in different ways. So
Yeah, I don't have much to add. You guys kind of covered everything. So, but yeah, I was just gonna say, like, I agree. I agree that you can't do something from a third party. You have to do it from within an already established, either Democrat or Republican. Just because, we saw with RFK, he tried to do something from the third party, and then he was like, all right, I'm not gonna win. I don't have a chance. So he joined the Republicans. And no, we see this where it's like we have a two-party system. There's no change in that. You have to do something within those parties.
Feel like question 9 had, or I mean, unit 9 had like fewer questions compared to 8. So, um, do we want to move on to unit 10? Because unit 10 and 8 were like relatively connected, I feel. Okay. Um, so unit 6, I mean, sorry, question 6, the two parts are required, and then we can skip 7 for now, and then we have to pick one of the two question eights, I think. Yeah, the one of the two sides. Um, so for question 6, what did you know, if anything, about the political scandals and or impeachment charges brought about against Trump by the Democrats or other topics covered in the Corruption of Lindsey Graham podcast?
I mean, kind of like before, all I really knew was that it was following the 2020 election and Trump's response to that, trying to call the election out as like a scam and that he actually won and stop the count and yada, yada, yada. So that's really all I knew about it going into it. The corruption of Lindsey Graham as well. Obviously, I knew who Lindsey Graham was and I knew that he was a Trump guy now and wasn't before, but I didn't know anything about his actual journey, for lack of a better word, to becoming one of Trump's guys.
Yeah, before this unit, the only thing that I knew is that like Lindsey Graham had shifted dramatically from like criticizing Trump to defending him, but I didn't realize just how active like Graham had become like behind the scenes. I think it was like in the podcast, the Trump's best friend one, where I learned that Graham like actually pressured the Georgia election officials, like asking about the whole like disregarding the ballots and like had a direct involvement in efforts to overturn the election results. But prior to this unit, like that's all I knew about him was just how he like had a shift from criticizing him to just becoming like his defender.
Yeah, I mean, it was I was listening. I even wrote this down. I said I found it crazy that Graham called Trump a lying MF in private and then was publicly defending him. And he also said like Trump could go to hell and all this other stuff about Trump. Yet in the end, he was defending Trump. And it's kind of just, it seems weird to me. I was not very honest.
Yeah. I mean, I was gonna say, like, prior to this unit, the only things I really knew, like political scandals, why like the 2016 like Russia thing, like that was a big thing that was brought up because that was kind of like the formative years of my life. I was like, oh, this is what's going on in politics right now. Um, that kind of stuff. And then, now there's more like the January 6th insurrection and that sort of things. Like I knew about that before, but that's kind of where my previous information lied.
I think prior to reading about this through this class, I definitely would look at the news and see talks about like, oh, Trump is getting impeached. What is happening there? And I just remember like thinking like all of this is like being said, but like no action is actually being taken because like Trump just like does not care. And especially like going and seeing like especially like for this past election, people being like, oh, Trump's a felon, like he can't do this, he can't do this, and yet like things were still going on. There were so many like scandals in regards to Trump, and yet it kind of felt pointless because nobody was doing anything about it. Like, or like people were trying to, but like nothing actually, from what I have seen, like there's not been any actual results.
Yeah, like to build off that, when I was like uh the first impeachment, they said he got impeached. And then like a week later, I was like watching the news. I was like, wait, I thought he got impeached. Why is he still in office? I didn't really understand what was going on. So yeah, pretty cool watching this. And like you said, there's never action. There's something that happens to paint him as a bad person, but then nothing happens after that.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely knew more about the second impeachment than the first, but the fact that there was a second impeachment in the first place and they didn't do anything about it, the first time was shocking to me. But I also didn't fully understand, especially the first time. Um, yeah, like I've always been into politics, but I was kind of confused about what was going on because, like they both just said, nothing was happening. They were impeaching him, going through with the trials, and then acquitting him. So it's just like it was kind of pointless in my opinion. But yeah, when it came to the second impeachment, I understood that way more, especially since, I was old enough to understand like what was happening at the Capitol and more about what Trump actually does. Um, but yeah.
Should we move on to the next part? Cool. I would say the most maddening thing, which is obviously like just the whole like entire unit, which was the fact that there were like dozens of examples of him being anti-Trump. Like he ran against Trump in 2016. He said he'd rather lose without Trump than lose with him. Like very, very, very anti-Trump. And then you see this kind of development where he continues to convince himself that like if I just defend him one more time, I'll get what I want and it'll all be okay. And then I know we're supposed to wait for other politicians, but like all the Republicans, you start watching them do that where they're like, okay, we'll calm him down. We'll keep him fine. He's good. He had an off day. He'll be better tomorrow. Like, that's not our guy. We don't know him. And then that's actually just been him the whole time. And they've been lying to themselves or trying to convince themselves of something else. When in reality, he has been this crazy guy the whole time. And they're acting like they're surprised now, like it hasn't been evident from the beginning.
Yeah, what honestly stood out most to me was how quickly like Graham actually flipped after January 6th. Like he gave like a really strong speech condemning Trump with like his whole count me out and insurrection day. But within actual days, like he walked it back completely after facing that backlash. It showed how his loyalty wasn't really to like democratic institutions or constitutional values. It was genuinely just for political survival. And it just made me rethink entirely how much like individual ambition can undermine like democratic norms because he genuinely just switched up. I want to say out of that fear alone, but yeah.
I think that was kind of one of the most interesting parts about this unit is that you can see that like in 2020 when they had like a chance to kind of revert back, like once Trump lost, they could have gone and kind of like backtracked more, like changed the way that they operated. But instead of doing that, they doubled down, focused on like bringing him back, which I think was weird, but like not like unforeseeable. Which is kind of it's interesting, but it's also maddening because it is kind of like what you said, like they're giving up like the trust of a lot of people in the country and like their trust in democratic institutions and kind of relying on like this guy with autocratic authoritarian tendencies or whatever. And like what you said, Madeline, with like he changes by the day. I thought it was really funny when they talked about like Tuesday Trump versus Thursday Trump. Like he's just a different guy. Like how does that make any sense? It's so odd to me how like that like they'll do anything to cover up like his like terrible behavior, like internationally and domestically. They're just like, well, that wasn't him. Couldn't have been him. He was just having an off day, whatever.
Yeah, I was gonna mention the Tuesday and Thursday Trump thing because it's like, well, wait, which one was the good guy? Hold on. Does anyone remember what Tuesday Trump was the
It was
good
the
guy?
Tuesday one because the Thursday was like the public speech.
Yeah, like yeah, he was on camera one of those days. So it's just like they really enable everything he does. I thought the whole podcast was just insane. But it was also really interesting because it's like, wow, like Graham continued to, well, first he was criticizing Trump, and then he continued to enable him and make up excuses for everything he was doing. And when he did lose to Joe Biden, I do feel like they definitely could have just been like, okay, we can back away. We don't have to support him anymore. We had to deal with him for 4 years. We don't have to deal with him now. But like Jack said, they wanted to bring him back. Graham, like as soon as Trump lost, Graham was like, just wanted him to stay focused on his movement. He'll be back in 4 years, and he came back in 4 years. But those who were criticizing him before definitely could have just been like, all right, we're free. But no, they didn't, because that's how corrupted they were. So that was really like, well, it was honestly everything to me was surprising, interesting, maddening. It was a lot. The whole podcast was a lot, honestly.
I mean, yeah, Graham was criticizing him, and then he was like, okay, now I have to join him because I have to bend the knee and join him because that's how I'm gonna get power, because he's the front runner by far. And then after Biden lost, or after Biden won, I mean, um, and you say they could have just stepped back, they kind of looked at it and were like, he's still like our number one guy to run in the next election, so we have to push him forward. And then Graham pushed for him because he's like, I want to get power just being in proximity to Trump and helping him out.
I think speaking on Graham and like some of the other guys, I think it was really interesting because you guys have like mentioned thus far, like these guys don't necessarily like want what Trump has been pushing for, but they just kind of do it because they'll keep their power. Um, and like we know that Graham like went out publicly after January 6th and was like, hey, like this wasn't okay. But then like privately, he was talking about how he's orchestrated a whole plan to get Trump back, like he was gonna make a comeback and everything. I think it's so interesting because some of these guys have like talked about how like, they want to speak out against Trump, want to be like, no, we don't rock with Trump. And I think one of the notes that I took was about the Georgia Secretary of State. There was a dinner with him, and he was like talking about, oh, like, yeah, I really wish I could speak my mind about Trump. And then when the reporter gave him the opportunity to do so, because there's a mic involved, he was like, no, this isn't the place to do it. Um, and so it just kind of shows like the evasiveness. And then we see that built throughout the entire Unit 10 of how like these guys will start off like not super defensive of him, but then like the more time goes on, the more they're willing to defend him. I think one of the quotes that was like, even if Trump is like 100% wrong, like he's gonna push and support him even harder. I forget where exactly I'll have to find, but I thought that was like crazy because it's like, yo, like if you know he's wrong, why support?
Well, yeah, I think they're only supporting him because they want the power themselves, like genuinely. Like they want to be along for the Trump ride because they know he has such a following that when he does, if he does get elected, yeah, that was they're kind of banking on him getting elected because he had such a following, and they just wanted power, really. That's all it is.
Yeah, another thing I wanted to add, I meant to say in my first answer too, but Graham was like, at first, he was claiming he was doing this so that, well, he was supporting Trump so that he can listen to his foreign policies. But that's the only, like, Graham wasn't worried about anything else but the foreign policies. So it's just like, yeah, he really cared more about power than like he cared more about power than sticking to his own beliefs and principles, because before Trump, he wasn't this. I feel like he had some more, like, he had better views, of course, better opinions. He wasn't just this terrible guy, but not that he's a terrible guy. But after Trump, though, it's just he really did that whole like 180, just over some foreign policy. I don't think that's valid enough to justify him enabling Trump for all those years. But it was all
I
about
think
power.
it's really interesting, like the relationship between Trump and Graham, like how it started, because Graham was very much, you had said, he was very focused on like foreign policy and like the international relations aspect of like being a part of the presidential cabinet. But it's like interesting because the way the differences between like Trump's ideas and like wants for like the United States, like Trump had like very much isolationist tendencies. Uh, And like on the back foot of that, Graham really, he was like a big globalist kind of guy. Like he supported NATO, he wanted to like do UN program, like things like that. Which is like the polar opposite of what Trump wanted to do. So like in order for, like you said, it's all about power. Um, in order for Graham to kind of influence the world to see the changes that he kind of wanted to, he had to like, I don't know, I think they said it in which chapter was this? Sorry, or episode two. It was like courting, like he was courting Trump in order to like get what he wanted, because they talk about like it started out with them like going to lunch together or golfing or whatever, and then it would eventually turn into dinners, and it's got a weird romantic relationship aspect to it, but it's like that's kind of what it takes, because they talk about it later too. It's like in order to like be successful in Trump's administration, you have to kind of like kiss his ass, for lack of a better term. Like you really have to lick his boot to get there. Because he's not, he's really like, he's like a benefactor to those that are kind to him. But like if you disagree with him even a little bit, you kind of just get shoved out the door. Like you saw that with like uh James Comey, like the FBI director that was like investigating him for like his the Russia thing in 2016. Um he fired him because he was investigating him, which is like, weird.
I actually have a personal experience with that. So I actually work at the Trump National Golf Course in DC. And there's many times where I'd have to set up meetings for him and different politicians. And one day Youngkin came in and I set up the meeting and everything. And I thought he was going to be like the vice president elect. And then I kind of did more research after JD Vance got elected, and he was way more like MAGA, gun ho MAGA than Youngkin was. And I was like, oh, well, that's because he kind of was like bending a knee more towards Trump. And Trump was like, all right, this is my guy. And Youngkin wasn't kissing up to him as much as JD Vance was.
Speaking on the JD Vance kissing up to him, like Trump literally said how like JD Vance like straight up like fell for him in like episode one. And so I thought it was like really like Trump is very much aware of that influence that he has on people, and that's kind of like what he pushes out for himself. And that's why he hates the people who oppose him so much, because he can't do that to them. But he very much to all of his supporters like makes them kind of his minions that like will humiliate themselves and say all these things, defend him when they don't even believe it. And like Trump is fully aware of all of that, but because he just has that kind of charismatic influence over everyone, like it works for him. Do we want to try to get through question 8, and then we could try to just do both sides within the next 15 minutes if it ends up happening. Um, Anyone have a preference? All right. Why don't we start with authoritarian impulses, because we've been kind of talking about that more so than constitutional stuff. In the conversation between Dr. Reckendorf and Dr. Newman before the election, Dr. Newman says that he's not optimistic about our political institutions' ability to keep Trump's worst authoritarian impulses in check. In your opinion, what, if any, of the many authoritarian concerns discussed by Dr. Reckendorf and Dr. Newman do you find most concerning? Which, if any, do you find most overblown?
Well, I will say when he first got elected, he was signing executive orders like no one's business. Like I think he what was it, I think he broke the record for most executive orders signed. And just an executive order is just a way to get around Congress and like the House and the Senate. Like you could just sign it and be like, oh, this is what I think. And it's kind of I don't know. It's there need to be more checks and balances for executive orders and how they take place.
Yeah, in my opinion, like the most concerning like authoritarian impulse discussed was Trump's like pressure campaign on the Department of Justice. I think he like it's where he urged officials to simply declare the election corrupt, and then I think he said like and leave the rest to me in the January 6th report. It shows like a blatant attempt to weaponize state institutions, not to enforce the law, but to cling to a power. It's almost like a textbook move and like democratic backsliding. In contrast, though, while Trump's obsession with like military parades and like symbolic like authoritarianism was concerning, it felt less immediately dangerous than like attempts to overturn elections. I feel like the real threat wasn't in the optics itself, it was in like the systematic attacks on like its core democratic process, if that makes sense.
I think one of the things that like I see the most of is like the attacks on the constitutional like checks and balances and things like that. But in like I think I mean we learn it like really young, like in high school or middle school. Like the Constitution is intentionally vague so that you get wiggle room and whatever, but it's not built for someone who's only looking for loopholes. Because like if you're only looking for loopholes, then you're looking to take advantage of like the ambiguity of how the Constitution is written and things like that. Um, Trying to find workarounds like executive orders, like like checks and balances, things like that. If you can find ways to work around those, then I mean, it's very concerning because then you can, take advantage of powers that you might not have had previously, like can or establishing a state of emergency so that you have power and like Congress has no checks over you. Like that sort of stuff, I think it should be concerning to most people, but I mean, it's weird because at the same time, a lot of like the constituents or like the voter base of the Republican Party is like, he knows better than we do. He knows better than they do. But like he doesn't. He's just some guy who has bankrupt casinos, which is insane that like he has the ability to interact with the economy in the way that he does, and people still support him in the way that they do. I don't know. But
I
yeah.
agree with what you say about Constitution not being built for loopholes. Like this is the document that's 300 years old. It hasn't been updated in a very, very long time. And since the last time it was updated, our society's completely changed and evolved. And so it's kind of hard to like I just don't it's just he shouldn't be able to just do whatever he wants by finding these loopholes.
I think also it's a bigger theme of the fact that he just doesn't care about any of our structures of government, the Constitution, any of it. He doesn't care. The only reason he's finding these loopholes is because he literally has to. If the Constitution didn't exist, or if he could get rid of it, he would. I find that to be the most concerning. One of my professors said something about how Trump is basically just throwing a bunch of stuff at the wall and hoping it sticks, which is working pretty okay for him. And I think that's what's really concerning is how little he cares about norms, expectations, laws, any of it it's just very concerning.
I remember when Trump was kind of first throwing himself on the political side of things, a lot of praise was given to him for the fact that they were going to be like, oh, like he's a businessman, he's not a politician, therefore, like he's going to be different. But I think part of that is what creates that much like disrespect for like the Constitution, like the institutions that have been established, is that like I mean, you guys know the stereotype about like how like businessmen will try to get away with whatever they can, find like loopholes in like the legal system, the business system, and like cut corners so that they can make more money. It very much feels like, I mean, Trump brought that aspect of business into government by trying to be like, oh, well, if I can do this myself and I can find a way to cut corners, I will. I mean, the whole thing about Elon Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency is like cutting corners and getting rid of jobs and getting rid of a lot of people and all these different government functions for the sake of like, cutting corners and just doing it the way that he wants to easier.
I think the question about which concerns do you find overblown is funny because I don't think any of them are overblown, at least in my opinion. I think if there's evidence that he doesn't support or want to follow the law, then any claim towards his authoritarian impulses should not be overblown. I actually am worried by people who are I think in a situation like this, it's better to overreact than underreact. So where there are a lot of people being like, no, it's fine. We have all these checks in places. He won't be able to do that. Sure, but what if he does? Like we should just be prepared in the event that like he is able to do all of these things. And he's been able to do a lot so far. So I would say that I don't find any concerns to be overblown. I would be interested if any of you disagreed. I would like to hear that. But if not, that's okay.
I think the whole like overblown thing is how we got to the situation in the first place. Um, Mitch McConnell had basically at the very beginning been like, Trump will not be able to change any foundations of anything. Like he'll be in power and whatever, and that's fine. But in Mitch McConnell's mind at that time, they were like, Trump will not have the ability to execute what he's saying that he will. And I mean, that's like a blatant example of someone who was like, oh, nothing will happen. And then yet things are happening. And then, he was forced to bend the knee to Trump. And so I think you'd have to try really hard to find something to label as overblown in my
Yeah.
eyes.
Sorry. Honestly, building off of that in general, I don't like I said, like I agree with you, Madeline. I don't think anything's necessarily overblown. I think I'm just gonna touch back. It's like when I said it's like some things felt less immediately dangerous. Like there were issues that there I think what he was saying was mostly concerning. However, there were some things that were just far more concerning where like other things get swept under the rug because obviously like him trying to overturn an election is like crazy. So when he has like an obsession with like military and stuff like the military parades, I feel like that gets shadowed over the stuff that's a lot more concerning. So I wouldn't say anything's overblown. I just think that some people tend to focus more on like things that seem like immediately threatening. But yeah.
I feel like it's also
Agree.
interesting because like, oh, sorry, because like our list of concerns for Trump versus other presidents is so different. Like a low thing on our list of concerns for him would be like, I don't know, the economy, not even, but you know what I mean. But then like people's issues with Obama were like when he wore a tan suit once. It's just like when we're talking about overblown concerns, I totally agree with you. It's just like prioritizing like what's the worst of the worst, not like, oh, these things are bad and he's doing these things okay. It's just like a list of just a bunch of bad things and you're ranking it by like most bad to least bad, which is really alarming.
I think also it kind of makes that difficult to like figure out what is like overblown or versus like what is an actual threat is that he makes so many. Like there are so many things that he has said that he's going to do. And I think Newman talked about it like in their little podcast thing. He was like authoritarian regimes only really need to make like or make good on like a certain amount of like the threats that they have to like create a legitimate sense of fear. Um, so I don't really think it's like he's going to do all of these things. It's like he's going to do some of them, and then you're going to be afraid that he's going to do the rest of them. So it's not really like overblown. It's just kind of it's hard to figure out what he's actually going to do. Because he does, kind of talk a lot about what he wants done, but like he doesn't necessarily make good on a lot of those, which is like the whole politicians always lie about like their agendas or whatever, but like he's doing like things that are genuinely harmful to most everybody.
I think what he also does in addition to that is he kind of supplements those like really big things with like certain things that like are so just out of the way that it's like, why was that like there were so many things that he'd do that it was like that's awful. But then we'd focus on something like him changing the name to Gulf of America, which is like that's just like weird. But it's like at the end of the day, like compared to some of the other stuff that he's doing isn't really that deep. And so it just kind of goes to show you how like successful he is at like distracting people from all of like the bigger things. And like obviously people are noticing the bigger things, but there are definitely like bigger things that slip by just from like the absurd things that he does end up doing.
I feel like it's
I think
that
one
way.
of the other things, oops, sorry, you
Yeah, just gonna be quick. I feel like it is that way because he's just doing a lot. Like he's been in office for, well, besides because I feel like the first term compared to what's happening now in the last couple of months wasn't too crazy. So it's just he's doing so much at once. It's hard to keep up because he's in the headlines for changing the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of America one day. Then he's signing executive orders to cut funding. He's targeting schools. Like he's just doing so much. And they're still gonna keep him in power. Like he's gonna continue doing a whole bunch of things at once to see what he gets away with, and he's getting away with majority of those things. So yeah, that's the main issue. Like, yeah, he knows how to manipulate. He knows what he's doing. That's the sad part.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that like I think one of the like it is hard to, especially for us because we are in college and like that sort of thing. We are like a younger like group of Americans. Like the things that might seem overblown to us might not be overblown to everybody. But like they talked about like in res like Trump's response to like the pro-Palestine protests on like campuses across the United States. Um, that sort of thing. Like I think it was either well, I mean, I guess it was either Reckendorf or Newman because those are the only two people in that podcast. But one of them said that like the response to that was like Trump said that he was going to enact law and order on these campuses in order to like make these students feel afraid or whatever. Um, has he actually done that? Maybe not, but his like his saying that he was going to do that kind of at least it made it feel like VCU kind of like has like a zero tolerance policy for protest now. You don't really see him much anymore, that sort of thing. So like the that kind of goes back to like the he only needs to make a few threats to like be legitimate because like they're afraid that or at least like institutions like VCU or like other public institutions like schools and stuff are going to be afraid of like federal backlash if they let their like young students who might disagree with what Trump is saying or like how the government is acting, they might like face consequences and budget cuts, I guess, being consequences, that sort of thing. But I think it's interesting, like what the people would kind of see as like an over or like an overblown thing, because it kind of just depends on the person.
I love that you mentioned all that because I think like we like as college students like we are usually the ones like targeted because college students tend to be the most active when it comes to disagreeing with the government. And that's why I think you see Trump focus so much on like colleges. I mean, he's never been a fan of them in the first place, but that's why you see him being like wanting to get rid of like international students, um wanting to like heavily penalize people for like protesting. And that's why you had like a lot of universities kind of fight back on Trump for the fact that he was trying to cut budgets for a lot of them, have them, and like Trump also wanted involvement within universities, like private institutions, about what they could teach and how. And so like he's obviously focusing a lot on the demographic that would like fight him the most because like if he can like slow that crowd down, like he's a lot more powerful.
I mean, it's super concerning because it's just other institutions, right? Like it's not the government, but it is like public and private universities. And I mean, some are fighting back, like you see Harvard fighting back, but then also there's schools like ours that just takes all of the sanctions and rolls with it. I mean, like the campus space utilization policies that VCU put in, I think at the end of last year that made it so people couldn't like chalk or protest in the campus, like that was pre-Trump and they were already like rolling over and taking it. I think it's really concerning that no one is willing to fight back, especially a school as like liberal and populated and as uncommon as they claim. It's just it's concerning seeing all of these like organizations just taking it and not fighting back.
Another example of that, sorry, I don't mean to take up anybody else's time, but I work for like the VCU housing department. And they have like their DEI initiative, like they have their office of like so like multicultural student affairs, all of those things. Like they've had to change the name of like the DEI like position, like the associate director for that position had to like change their name. They get to keep their job, but it's called something entirely different now. Um, and it's kind of scary because you do think about like all of these people trying to do good things in these public universities. Because why would you not like diversity, equity, or inclusion? It's kind of a crazy thing to not like. Um, but like you see the changes in that. Thankfully, like if you just change like the wording of it, a lot of the time it's okay. But the fact that they had to do that or they would lose their job or that department is scary, and that's happening everywhere. And like public institutions rely a lot on like, like federal support and like government support for funding and things like that. Versus like an institution like Harvard, which has a ton of money, because they're like a private institution, they can do kind of their own thing. So I think it's a little bit different depending on if it's like a public versus a private institution, because Harvard does get a lot of credit for standing up to like Trump and stuff, but at the same time, they're a super rich school. They're an Ivy League. Like it's great that they're doing it, but like they don't have as much to lose. Like if like VCU stood up against it, there's a lot more at like risk here than somewhere like that.
Not to praise VCU because I completely disagree. I want to preface that. But there's also like the thing to be said about like what hills you want to die on. Granted, I don't think VCU is dying on the right hills, but like kind of to Jack's point about Harvard being like super rich, like for these institutions that like very, very heavily depend on this kind of money, like are they implementing different things that could, offset the harm that's being created? And I think like VCU obviously isn't doing that, but if it was, like that would make things just slightly better. Because like at the end of the day, not everyone can be in a position. And this is more so for people than like less institution, but like you're not always in a position to fight back in the way that you want. It's more so like how can you make the best of your situation? Obviously, I mean VCU isn't doing it in the way that we'd like to see, but yeah.
I feel like it's a lose-lose. I'm gonna keep this short because I know we're over time. I feel like it's a lose-lose though, especially now that we're talking about VCU, because it's like, say VCU did decide to keep their, everything DEI, then we lose funding, most likely. And like the students, maybe the community is happy that this happened, but like VCU, once again, like they lose funding, right? Now, VCU, complied with Trump and its community is upset. Like people don't like that. So I feel like it's a lose-lose. Like when it comes to Trump, it's just a lose. He's the only one winning, honestly. He's doing whatever he wants and taking advantage of that. Everybody else is getting affected. Even people who support him are affected. Like it's really just a lose-lose in my opinion. Like when VCU, sent out that email about why they didn't really explain why, but basically justifying their decision or whatever. It's just like, as somebody who's, first of all, I'm out of state, so like I get federal funding, so just like I was kind of understanding, but at the same time, I'm also like African American and I'm a female, so just like it kind of sucks, but it would have sucked if my funding was taken away as well. So it's just like, yeah, I feel like there's just so many factors and it's hard to come to like a real solution just because of who's in charge. So yeah.
If nobody else has closing thoughts, I think we're all good to dip out. All right, bye guys.
Big discussion.
Bye.